And I think we're on.
We're on. We're back. I hope you're watching us. This conversation is going to be, well, you're walking down the street. The cop just comes up, jumps out of the car, throws you against the wall, goes in your pockets, does a complete search of you. Now, before we get to the question of can they do that, let's ask where is the source of law to find out what your rights are?
Good question.
And then we can find out whether that what's inside that piece of this source that you have.
And they should be able to answer that question based on our previous discussion.
Yes. So, where do you go to find out if the cop can do this or not? Excuse me, police officer can do this or not? Well, what about the U.S. Constitution? Does that apply?
It might.
Yeah, I
Are these
think
police officers, are they federal?
that's a good question. No, they're not federal officers.
They're state?
They're state officers.
Okay, so let's look at the state constitution.
Yes.
Okay.
And we could also look at the federal constitution because the federal constitution and the state constitution apply here because the federal constitution deals with your rights against the government, and the state constitution also deals with your rights against that particular state's government.
That's
So
right.
many people know about the federal constitution, but people think a lot less about individual state constitutions. They are just as important. Why are they so important? Because these individual state constitutions can provide you more rights than the federal constitution. Never less, but more.
Right. And I think that's a good point that the students may need to know. The federal government creates the basics, the basis, the minimum, and the state can certainly grant more than that.
Yes. So I'm sure you've heard on all these series, well, you'll need a warrant for that. Okay, so we know that your rights against this police officer are going to be, there's the source of your rights going to be the state and federal constitutions. Now let's take a look in the federal constitution for a second. Is there a particular, where do you go? Is there a particular amendment? Yes, there is. It's the Fourth Amendment that talks about search and seizure. And talks about whether government officials, i.e. the police, can search and seize you and under what particular circumstances. So, you've heard I need a warrant for that, and that's what the Fourth Amendment says. So, the Fourth Amendment says you need a warrant to conduct particular types of searches. Now, let's go back to our video that we had about Section 1.2, where I, the government, the police officer, had a warrant to go into Apartment A. By mistake, I went into Apartment B. In Apartment B, I found controlled substances, i.e. drugs, guns, whatever. And the question is, can these guns be used against the person who owned the apartment? So go back again to the Fourth Amendment. Think about, okay, the government needs a warrant to do things, but the government didn't have a warrant to go into this apartment. They had a warrant to go into that apartment. So the defendant, the person who's going to be arrested in apartment B where the government went, is going to say, okay, the evidence that you found should not be included. In fact, it should be excluded. It should be kept out of any procedure against me because when you came into my apartment without a warrant, you violated my Fourth Amendment rights. And the idea from case precedents, it doesn't say anything actually in there about, well, what happens in this situation, but situations have come up before. The courts have made decisions. The idea is that when the government violates your particular rights and they obtain evidence against you, that evidence should be excluded. That's the concept of the exclusionary rule. The question now is, does the exclusionary rule apply in the scenario we had where the government goes by mistake into apartment B when they have the warrant for apartment A?
And to say, does the exclusionary rule apply, does that rule keep evidence out?
Yes. Does it exclude evidence? So that's where we are. So to find out the answer to that question, we have to look at cases, case precedents, case law to find out what the highest court in the state or what the U.S. Supreme Court has done in this particular instance. Now, what the court has done has said that in this scenario, the evidence comes in. It is not excluded, it is brought in against a person who was in that apartment, even though they didn't have a warrant to go into that apartment. They had a warrant for that one. Why? Because the Supreme Court decided that since the government, i.e. the police officers, acted in good faith, therefore the evidence comes in. Okay, you've got a rule, you've got a concept, you've got a document, U.S. Constitution, you've got a particular area, Fourth Amendment, you've got to understand what the Fourth Amendment is, and you've got an exception to what might be deemed the exclusionary rule, where the Fourth Amendment keeps out evidence that the government obtained illegally. The Supreme Court said there's an exception here. This is an exception. Now, you've got that decision. Now apply it to the one that you had to write about. And the one that you had to write about, the police officers went into apartment A with a warrant, found drugs or guns, whatever. Later on, it was determined that that warrant itself, to get a warrant, you need probable cause, that warrant itself was invalid. How does that case compare to the one we just talked about? Question for you. Should the evidence be included or should it be excluded? In other words, is scenario number 2, the case we just did, like the one before where the drugs came in against the defendant, or is it a little bit different? So that's what the question is. The answer, I think it's all done in good faith. Therefore, all the contraband comes in. Now, so if you are the defendant who's been convicted under in other words, your argument that the United States Constitution excludes this evidence from coming in against me because what the government, i.e. the police officers, did violated my Fourth Amendment rights, you've lost that case. The question now is, can you go anywhere else? Because you were just in the federal court system. Can you go anywhere else? Because if you can't go anywhere else, that means you're going to jail. What other avenues do you have?
And I think that's a starting point to refer to something that we talked about earlier. Since the federal rights creates the minimum, now the students should take a look at the state rights to see if that particular defendant has more rights granted by the state. So it doesn't necessarily stop with just the federal government.
Right.
The students should now take a look to see what the respective state.
Because you know you've got the bundle of rights, you've got U.S. constitutional rights, and you've got your state constitutional rights. The state constitutional rights can give you more rights than the United States Constitution.
And I think that helps the students to understand when we talk about federalism, that federalism is a two-tier system of government.
Yes. So what do? You go to the state constitution, see what the state constitution says, and if the state constitution provides more rights in this situation, some state constitutions do. In other words, in this particular case that we talked about in the video about going into the wrong house, they went to the state constitution and they decided that under the state constitution that the individual is protected and the evidence will be excluded. Example where the state constitution provides more rights. That's important because you understand the difference in the federal constitution and state constitution, how state constitution give you more rights.
So then, just to recap, I think in part A of this hypothetical, because the officers acted in good faith, the exclusionary rule does not apply and the evidence comes in
against the defendant.
And then for part B of this, once the students or once the defendant will have exhausted all of his or her federal rights, then they should look to the state.
Yes.
Okay. And if you have any questions about this, again, you can contact Dean Paschal and me via the questions for the instructor option here in Blackboard.